Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Business and Human Rights in Latin America. My name is Jen Malat from Cambridge University Press, and before we get started, I want to go over just a few items so you know how to participate in the event. You've all joined in listen-only mode. However, you will have the opportunity to submit questions by typing into the Q&A box. You can send your questions at any time during the discussion, and there will be some time at the end for the panelists to go over them. If you have any technical difficulties, please also add this to the Q&A box, and a member of the organizing team will endeavor to help you. In the unlikely event we experience any major technical issues, we'll message the audience and restart the webinar. The whole event will take about 1 hour, and to get everything started, I'm delighted to turn things over to Humberto Cantu Rivera, who will introduce the panelists.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, and good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are, perhaps even good night. It's a pleasure to join you for this event. And I would like to, of course, welcome and thank again the co-panelists in this event, Ana Claudia Ruiz-Cardia Achabayan from Mackenzie University in Brazil, Enrique Prieto Rios from Universidad del Rosario in Colombia, Ulf Thune from Universidad de La Sabana in Colombia as well, and Daniele Pamplona from the Pontificia Universidad Católica do Paraná in Brazil. As you may be aware, yesterday, and of course for the last few days, the special issue on business and human rights in Latin America was finally launched by the Business and Human Rights Journal. And it's actually a very interesting process that we've followed to get this project underway and finally published that basically took about 3 or 3.5 years and included a workshop with many of the authors who actually were able to publish their manuscripts or developments in the field in the resulting text. So we would like to begin by thanking everyone who was involved, both authors, prospective and final authors, peer reviewers who were very supportive in doing all of these revisions and working with the authors in improving their papers, and particularly, of course, the team at Cambridge University Press, Rebecca O'Rourke and Jennifer Malat for their help in putting together this webinar, and last but not least, of course, the editors-in-chief of the Business and Human Rights Journal, Suryadeva, Anita Ramasastry, Florian Wettstein, and Michael Santoro. All of them gave the green light several years ago when we came to them with this proposal, and the final result that we can see here is precisely this set of articles, this collection of articles and shorter pieces addressing why is Latin America an important test field on the one hand for global business and human rights standards, but also a source of global business and human rights standards. And that means that it is a region that has contributed and can contribute a lot to this global conversation. What will follow in the next few minutes will be an initial intervention by my co-panelists here, who will address particularly that specific question. Why is it important to discuss business and human rights in Latin America? And after that, we will give the floor to each one of them to answer specific questions, while also leaving some time for Q&A if there are any specific comments or questions from the audience. So I would like to begin by giving the floor to Ana Claudia Ruiz-Cardia Achabayan from Mackenzie University in Sao Paulo, Brazil. Ana Claudia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Humberto. It's great to have you here. And thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you very much for the Cambridge University Press for the invitation for this seminar. And I'd like to welcome everyone who's here watching us. And also, I would like to congratulate all the professors that are here and that published in our journal. Well, with regard to the topic in Latin America, when you're talking about business and human rights in Latin America, I think it's really important to have this issue at the time, because we need to look at business and human rights under our particularities. So our region is really rich in natural resources, what actually makes the exploration of not just the natural resources, but also the human rights of people who are engaged in all those activities, business activities. It makes the situation actually really hard for everyone to who are involved in this kind of violations of human rights here in Latin America. So all of them are actually part of this of the system that most of the time is connected to the activities that transnational corporations that are hosted in European countries or in American countries, in the global north, we could put in this way. We are kind of victims of this system that I'm pretty sure that Enrique is going to speak later about it, that is connected to international investments in the field, in the area of Latin America and other global South countries. So we need to look at this topic of business and human rights here under these particularities and also under the centrality of the suffering of the victim. And I think it's really important to stress that, especially because when you're talking about this, we had this theory created under the Inter-American Court of Human Rights jurisprudence. So I think it's really important to talk about business and human rights in Latin America, especially under this particularity. I also believe that in the recent couple of years, we also had the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, stressing the importance to look at business and human rights under a more fundamental rights perspective. So I think it's important also to add this to this debate. And when we are talking about an Eurocentric point of view on business and human rights, I truly believe that our scholarship here in Latin America has to play this important role in presenting our point of views under those premises, of course, and trying to combat sometimes the ways that the topic is being discussed and coming to all of us here, for an example, on some national action plans that sometimes are not actually being fully applied in our region and are not considering our particularities, our differences. And that's why I believe that not just this issue of the journal at this time, but also the work we've been developing in the last few years in our region with the academics here is really important to make some important stress on the topic in Latin America and making our voices being heard, and not just our voices as academics, but most especially the voices of the victims of human rights violations. So that's why I think it's really important to have this meeting today. And I thank you, Humberto, again, and the Cambridge University Press for the invitation.
Thank you very much, Ana Claudia. Indeed, Latin America has a very important role to play, both as a source, but also as a test field. And I would thus like to give the floor to Enrique Prieto Rios, who is a specialist in investment law and human rights, also just as Ana Claudia, with several publications on the topic. And Enrique, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Humberto, and thank you all the authors and editors of this special issue, and also, of course, I'm very grateful for the invitation made by Cambridge University. So indeed, Humberto, this is a very important question, and I'd like to build on what just was said by Ana Claudia. And for that purpose, I just would like to start saying that the relationship between Latin America and companies and businesses could be seen as a dialectical relationship. Why? On the one hand, one could argue that companies have helped historically in the construction of the newly independent states, but also one could argue that it creates jobs, brings new technology, and contributes on the development of countries. But it also has had a negative impact, and it is mainly because a lot of companies that come here, as it was already expressed, come from the global north or have the interest of reaching the global north companies. And as such, historical patterns, we are witnesses of historical patterns of human rights violations. So I just want all of us to think about this wonderful Colombian writer, José Eustacio Rivera, and his book La Vorágine, but also the English reporter Norman Thompson with his book called Putumayo Red Book. Both of them reported on the human rights or on the violations of rights by companies, by robber companies in the 1900s against indigenous peoples and campesinos. But then we need to move not far from the beginning of the 20th century. Then we have in Colombia, for instance, all the negative effects of the United Fruit Company that, of course, we all know that had a heavy presence all over Latin America. But in the Colombian case, we have this company ordering, and with the complicity of the Colombian government, ordering the killing of workers that were striking because of their interest to claim protection for their basic rights. But then we could move forward and think about different examples. For instance, in Latin America, we have all the gender-based challenges of implementing business and human rights agenda, but also, and this is very interesting, by 2020, the Business and Human Rights Center reported that out of 209 lawsuits against companies for human rights violations around the world, 51 cases relate to human rights abuses which took part in Latin America. That's a very important number. So all this historical background and all this data, just to mention that in the case of Latin America, it's important to talk about business and human rights for different reasons. First, historically, we've been the victims, or communities in Latin America have been the victims of companies' misbehavior. Second, because in Latin America, we have broad development in protection of human rights, either at the inter-American system, but also at the domestic system. I like this concept of the transformative constitutionalism, or ICAL, that shows that development. But third, most importantly, is that there is a growing academic interest on this topic, but also social movements interested on business and human rights, as well as politicians. So having said all that, I just want to ratify that Latin America, more than lab or experimental fieldwork, is the place where we need to center our attention to talk, research, and discuss the global agenda on business and human rights. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Enrique. And I would just like to add one more thing that is actually also very relevant, and that is the role of Latin American corporations worldwide. Because even though in principle, many of them should have learned about, the situation and experiences of other companies operating in the region, the truth is that many of these practices, both good and bad, can be replicated and can be replicated in their operations overseas and even within the region. So that's another phenomenon that I think it's very important to highlight. I would like now to turn over the floor to Daniele Pamplona for the same question. Daniele, please go ahead.
Thank you, Humberto. Well, I would like to begin by thanking dear friends Humberto and Ulfi for the partnership on this project. It has been really rewarding to work with you. And I make mine Humberto's words, thanking the whole team at Cambridge and the editors-in-chief they have tirelessly worked with us to make this launch possible. Of course, I thank the authors who have been working with us for the past 3 years. It's also an honor to be here with such distinguished co-panelists. And of course, I also thank our audience for being here with us today. So, Humberto, I would like to begin addressing your question by also remembering this history of Latin America. It is a history that involves human and natural resources exploitation that allows the improvement and maintenance of the standard of living of people that are just like us, but who, because they live in other countries, seem to be more entitled to access the living conditions they choose to have than we are. So business and human rights is about establishing the wrongs corporations may inflict in people and environment, and establishing a state and corporate role to prevent, to mitigate, and to redress those wrongs. And the region has been struggling with the growing power of corporations for years. And truthfully, there is a lot to do. In fact, we are far from achieving structural changes that could represent substantial alterations in people's lives. And proposals to address the shrinking state space and the strengthening of corporate power, they need to emerge from the region, or they need at least to pass through the sieve of those who understand the specific characteristics of our people, including the culture, the legal practice. We need to debate the issue because periodically there is the launching of a new idea with promises of solutions, and only the region has the legitimacy to evaluate each new promise to establish its viability, its positive and negative points. So if we want to handle an issue, find a solution to a problem, we might wisely consult with the people who is directly linked to this issue. And I think that this special issue is a path to promote this. As our audience will notice as they read the different chapters, it is visible that the region can produce important criticisms of the solutions that are presented. But perhaps even more important than this is the capacity to frame the problem in an integral whole way with respect for all those involved. So my first impression to your question relates to the fact that within the region, we will find creative answers based on our different and peculiar ways of facing the world and our needs as plural societies. Second, it is long needed for the field of business and human rights to turn to regional views and needs. They were first explored by the global north. It is populated, even accidentally, with views that disregard the south. The Business and Human Rights Journal is, of course, amongst the very best, the high quality of the articles that are published here. They just they reflect the commitment and seriousness of its editors and its editorial board. And all the seriousness led to this special issue. It's also the result of people that are aware of the need to take this conversation regional, and people who is concerned that it should be done by the region. And briefly, in the third place, I would like to mention I'd like to refer to what Professor Ana Cláudia was mentioning about the inter-American system. We do count with this inter-American system, and it has been developing standards on business and human rights that have culminated with the release by the rapporteur on the economic, social, cultural, and environmental rights on the report on the inter-American standards for business and human rights. But this is a product of years of work. It was 2001 when the General Assembly of the Organization of American States has requested an analysis about social responsible business conduct. It was 2005 when we had a recommendation for states to develop and promote awareness relating to this issue. It was 2012 when a resolution has recognized the responsibility of corporations to promote and respect human rights. And it's not only by the General Assembly. We have hearings in the Commission, the Inter-American Commission, that since 2004, specifically for indigenous rights, it has been promoting and raising awareness for the fact that it's not always the state who has been violating human rights. Corporations are also a part of that. And of course, there's so many cases that I'm not going to go into all of them, but just against Brazil, we have either in the commission or in the court since 1985, Brazil has been condemned for violating property, life, health of indigenous people. And most recently, we have the condemnation of Brazil because it omitted itself from taking measures that will prevent violations of especially women's rights in the case of the workers of the firework factory. So this is something else that we have here, and it's full of cases, full of ideas. We are very creative, and I'm sure that we can find things that we can take to the rest of the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Danny. And without further ado, I turn over to Ulf Thöne. Ulf, please go ahead.
Thanks a lot, Humberto. Good morning from Bogota to everyone who's listening to us. Thank you very much to my co-editors, Danny and Humberto. Thanks for my co-panelists, Anna and Enrique, and thanks to the editors of the BHR Journal and Cambridge University Press for setting up this event and helping us and supporting us over the past 3 years or so. And obviously, thank you very much for everyone who's tuned in this morning. I hope we have time for many critical questions and interventions later on. I am somewhat the odd one out because I actually work in a management department and I'm not a lawyer working on business and human rights. And this is kind of where I come from. And I think it's very exciting to have this space to actually dialogue and to escape our academic silos and departments and to bring together these two very important perspectives of law on the one hand and management on the other hand. So a very legal, normative view and a very pragmatic view, and to have this conversation, and not only have this conversation with our colleagues, fellow academics, but also I think very importantly with practitioners, both in public policy, on a national, regional and global level, but also of course with business leaders, and increasingly so with our students, and starting with undergraduate students. And I think this is something perhaps we can come back to, the issues of business education and education of young lawyers in Latin America. How can we increase their ideas and visions on business and human rights? The panelists who've just talked before me already flagged up very important issues around business and human rights in Latin America. And I just perhaps wanted to add a couple of insights very briefly. I think as a foreigner who has lived in Latin America for a while now and worked here for a while, it's very important to understand that without understanding the reality of informality across society and across societal institutions, we will perhaps never understand Latin America, its past, its present, and its future. And that, of course, is a major, major challenge for anyone who's involved in legal issues in Latin America. In other words, this is a major opportunity for socio-legal studies or sociologists of law. Latin America is very rich in case studies for anyone involved in socio-legal studies. And it shows how we have to, first of all, have to have an awareness of this massive gap between law on the books, on the one hand, where I think our special issue also shows many, many advances, and law in reality and law in practice, which is a completely different thing in Latin America. And history and our present times have shown and indicated this. Maybe two more issues my co-panelists haven't yet mentioned. I think we should also at some stage talk about state-owned enterprises and their impact on business and human rights in Latin America. And for instance, in the energy space, which is so important, not only for the region, but for the whole world, we have, of course, Pemex, we have Ecopetrol in Colombia, and we have Petrobras in Brazil as the most important energy producer in Latin America. And secondly, and finally, we have to talk about the rise, or rather the reality of China in Latin America and Chinese business activities. And this also refers back to my previous point about state-owned enterprises, simply because almost all Chinese businesses are state-owned enterprises. And so we have to also talk about different legal cultures, different legal traditions, and this clash that we see increasingly playing out in Latin America as well. And fortunately, in our special issue, there is an entire article dedicated to this theme. So thank you very much. And I hand over to Umberto.
Thank you, Wolf. And indeed, there are many different aspects and angles that we have to consider when we discuss this regional context and reality. And I would like to basically, before turning over to you again for your specific questions, to highlight some of the articles that have been published in this special issue that you can find at the webpage of the Business and Human Rights Journal. Beyond an introduction by Ulf, Daniele, and myself, there are four or five actually, scholarly pieces, starting with particularly the scholarly production on business and human rights in Latin America, a systematic review conducted by Cristina Blanco, Bizarreta, and Veronica Beta as well. There is a very interesting piece on investor rights and obligations by Nicolas Perrone, our colleague from the Southern Cone. Also, as Ulf just mentioned, a piece on the approach of the Inter-American system to state-owned enterprises' human rights obligations by Judith Schonsteiner. Also, another very important topic that actually has led to a very intense discussion in the region and changes in the legal framework, particularly on the marketing of ultra-processed food and beverages to children in the region, and particularly, well, how do companies and states react in that area, in that industry, particularly to the UNGPs. And finally, as the scholarly articles, another one by Roger Merino on the politics of localizing human rights in Chinese policies and corporate practices in Latin America. In addition to those 5 scholarly articles, we have several developments in the field pieces, starting with Laura Treviño, who writes about procurement, sustainability, and human rights, and 3 other pieces addressing access to justice, which seems to be a common trend in Latin America. One focusing on the experience of transitional justice in Colombia by Carolina Olarte and Marco Velázquez from Javeriano University. Another one by Danilo Garrido, Alves, Daniela Arantes, and Camila Manfredini on the Samarco case and the simplified indemnification system. And particularly as a final point, a contribution by Miguel Barbosa and myself on corporate liability for human rights abuses in Latin American courts. And all of this is completed not just by 3 more DIF pieces that address different topics, not necessarily related to Latin America, but by one very interesting book review by Daniele Pamplona on Ana Claudia Roycardia Chavayan's book on named Transterritorialidade, a new theory on responsibility of businesses for human rights violations. Having said that, I would like to jump then to our next part of the conversation and to focus on some specific questions that the participants, panelists here have prepared in the prior few hours, I would say. And let me start with you, Ana Claudia, and to ask you about one very current and important topic, that is ESG, environmental, social, and governance criteria. What is ESG and why is it relevant in our region?
Thank you very much, Humberto. The acronym ESG represents the need that corporations have to be engaged in environmental, social, and governance standards in order to be fully sustainable and also attend the SDGs and then 2030 agenda of the United Nations. It is important to stress that ESG is situated in under the 2nd pillar of the UNGP. So its application would have by premise would have to be implemented voluntarily by corporations. We could also say that ESG is some kind of evolution of the CSR practices, corporate social responsibilities, but under some perspective that now is being more regulated and expected by the market that this engagement is also real. So I would say that when we are discussing ESG issues, we need to make this difference between business and human rights as a whole theory and ESG, whereas ESG is actually located, because we are seeing a lot of confusion on this, and I think it's important to create this difference here in the topic. I also believe that when you're talking about ESG nowadays, this is a no turning point for corporations. We need to be engaged in this new theory that is now so maybe they are trying to change some part of the clauses of this topic under the CSR, but I think it's important for us to be attentive to what is going on now with ESG. Specifically talking about Brazil, we do not have any law in this topic. There are just some projects, bill projects that are being discussed in the Congress nowadays. And I think it's important for us to bear in mind that when we are talking about ESG, it's not just the company has to comply with the rules, the existing rules of the country, but also need to create more new programs and more initiatives that could potentialize its sustainability projects under society. But when you're talking about Brazil again, although we do not have a specific bill on this topic, there are some regulations come from some for the central bank, for an example, or under our SEC, or Securities Exchange Commission, the CVM in Brazil, that have some focus on ESG practices, and also especially with the focus on practice or explain. So companies, they need to report even more that they are trying to achieve ESG practices, so we can, we as society can also be attentive to that. In Brazil, what we are seeing at the time mostly is that this discussion is being held specifically by the financial market, also trying to be aware of some of these discussions abroad. And I think it's important for us, especially here in Brazil, not just in Brazil, but of course in Latin America, under this topic, that we need to be to pay attention to what is being discussed in Europe and the US, especially because most of our corporations, they export commodities to those countries, and also other services that need to be in accordance to the regulations that are coming from Europe and from the US more specifically. For an example, when you're talking about the SFDR in Europe, the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, so it needs we need to report if our companies are being in compliance with those regulations regarding ESG and the protection of environmental standards. Also, when you're talking about these discussions on due diligence laws that could potentialize the topic of ESG here in Brazil as well, and our companies need to be aware of that, and also in Latin America. I think most of the people think that ESG might be some kind of just a smoke, that we are just trying to talk about this at the time, but it's something that might not lead to judicialized cases, or that corporations will still act on behalf of human rights violations. And I think we need to, as I say, we need to make this difference on business and human rights in ESG, of course. But what I'm seeing at the time here in Brazil specifically, but still it's ongoing, it's something that we are seeing at the moment. There are some judicial actions that are trying, in a consumerist way, to make to hold corporations accountable for some of greenwashing cases. So what we are trying to see now is that not just the customers, they need to be aware of those practices in order for the companies not just to use this as a marketing tool, to have a better image under society, under investors as a whole. So I think it's important for us to look at this topic with more attention at the time, specifically concerning our particularities that we spoke before, not just to become some reproducers of norms that are coming from the global north, but also for us as a customer, for us as customers, to have this importance of how corporations need to be attending those environmental, social, and governance issues that are being created, not just for marketing purposes. So I think it's important for us to be in touch with the topic. I think it's important for us to stress the differences, and to make not just the market, but also customers more specifically, and the victims, most of the victims of human rights violations, that they could also use this those programs that are being created as a tool to watch corporations not to fulfill more, to be engaged in more human rights violations and environmental violations as well. So it's important for us to be in touch with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I would echo your call to understand why do we need these type of practices, and not just try to bring them in for the sake of bringing them in. But it's actually quite relevant to have this conversation. One of the things that I would like to add to that is that, as you just pointed out, many companies have started to look into other areas that were not traditionally their focus, precisely because of this conversation. So it can add some dimensions to corporate responsibility and to corporate practices, more than responsibility. But the more important part is to ensure that it is used in the right way, that is to focus on prevention, and eventually, if needed, on remedy. Enrique, let me turn to you. And you're an expert in investment and human rights. And I would like to ask you if, in your view, there are any relevant trends coming out of Latin America in this area.
Well, thank you, Humberto. And indeed, first thing to say is that because of the fragmentation of international law, we as scholars, practitioners, people doing international public policy, they have identified that there is a direct clash, or there have been a direct clash between international human rights and international investment law. And that's why we have, for instance, this discussion, this ongoing discussion under the treaty draft on business and human rights. If we all remember, at some point there was this idea of prioritizing human rights over investment treaties obligations. And also we have, for instance, the Human Rights Council suggestion, or this document on the right to development in international investment law. Now, having said this, in order to identify that this is a very important topic, I consider that Nicolas Perrone, in his article telling us about how to bridge the gap between foreign investor rights and obligations, and he really identifies these important developments that have come forward from Latin America. Now, I don't want to spoil all of you reading this, well, the issue, and of course, the article of Nicolas Perrone, but having said that, I would like to mention a few things. First, there is this ongoing trend in Latin America with BIT models. And by BIT, for all of you that are not familiar with international investment law, it stands for bilateral investment treaties. Now, there is this ongoing trend in Latin America to include now human rights, mention human rights standards within the treaty drafting, in the sense that companies must comply with that. That's the first important advancement. The second thing is that countries like Colombia are actually including that in real treaties, right? And I say this because a lot of times, one of the main criticisms to BIT models is that they look great, but they're never applied. Now, we have, for instance, the case of the BIT between France and Colombia, which in its Article 11 includes a corporate social responsibility clause that directly mentions about, or makes some mentions about, human rights, labor rights, environment, and so on and so forth. So that's another important development. Third, and it comes with ISDS, investor-state dispute settlement, and is the case of Philip Morris and Uruguay, right? This is a case in which an arbitral tribunal decided this claim of PMI against Uruguay, because Uruguay was trying to take measures to promote people stop smoking. And then at the end, what was very interesting is that the arbitral tribunal took into consideration human rights arguments and health arguments put forward by the state. And of course, that opened a very important door for other tribunals to discuss this very important matter. Further, and I conclude saying this, is that now governments are more aware about how to negotiate these treaties, and about the importance of including clauses that could be a corporate social responsibility clause, or for instance, a clause trying to limit the scope of the fair and equitable treatment, or for instance, what amounts to indirect expropriation, in the sense of trying to protect the regulatory ability of the state when dealing with human rights issues. So that will be my answer to your question, Humberto, and I hope I was clear enough.
You were indeed. Thank you very much, Enrique. And yes, investment is one of those areas where Latin America is trying to push some ideas, but also still needs a lot to learn, has a lot to learn, considering its recent and not so recent experiences in this area. Very well, let me turn over then to you, Daniele, and I would like to ask you about the national approaches to business and human rights, and particularly Brazil. What has happened in Brazil in BHR? What may change, and where are we heading?
Well, Humberto, Brazil has followed quite a different path on the theme when compared with other countries in the region that have, for instance, adopted a national action plan. Our constitution is from '88, and it has not only allowed, but also it has fostered the adoption of public policies and regulations that aim to protect children, elderly, consumers, or to have concern with gender issues. And that happened because of the extended list of fundamental rights that it carries. They were not specifically connected to business activities, but they ended up having some interference on it. For instance, the Code for the Defense of the Child, it has implications in the way that corporations advertise for children. But those legislations, they are not sufficient to tackle many of the issues related to the business and human rights field. There was a combination of factors, in my view, that can together explain the development of a rights regime that is now applied in various situations in the country. So these factors are the absence of a specific legislation on this, the fact that our constitution is so rich in rights, and also the period of time when it was happening, because it was a time of strengthening the constitutional norms, giving them more normativity, precisely to address the lack of realization of rights. So I would say that it's safe to say that our Supreme Court has been progressive regarding realization of rights since the effects of same-sex marriage, until recognition of a right to a healthy environment, for instance. But I still think that there is room to take this development to the next level and use it precisely in face of corporations. For this is relevant that we discuss, but because I feel that we actually need to raise awareness, inclusive between the people that actually bring those lawsuits to the judiciary. Our civil law regime, for instance, it has statutes providing for a system of liability, which is also useful to provide for redress, though some of the burdens on victims are still considerable. And what I mean is our judiciary came a long way, but there's still more to do, and it can only do if someone actually asks the judiciary to do more. When we turn to the executive, the absence of the NAP, it was faced with the decree in 2018, Decree 9571, which provides for the national guidelines for business and human rights. It was very criticized because it's a voluntary measure. So in my view, it could only serve to stir the subject a bit in the country with no substantial consequences. And since then, Brazilian interest in being an OECD member has pushed forward the elaboration of a national plan on responsible business conduct. This one is something that we succeeded in doing, but it is not robust enough to promote changes. But there is a vibrant, organized civil society in the country, and we actually have to give them the credit for most of the little advancement so far. Although they fiercely fought any talk about the UNGPs in the beginning, more and more it becomes clear that this is one of the many ways we can deal with this problem. They were also very vocal on the process that led to a bill that is now in Congress that aims to replace the decree I just mentioned. And they were also very vocal, they are very vocal on the treaty process sessions in the UN. Well, the current government has not dedicated human and financial resources for this, but the hopes are high that the new government will face the issue in a more adequate manner. Companies, they are increasingly engaging in self-regulatory measures. This is what Professor Ana Cláudia was telling us. And of course, some good is always taken from that, especially for the ones who are directly affected. But we know how hard, if not impossible, it is to move forward with only self-regulatory measures. Due diligence in human rights, for instance, is far away from most of the company's agenda. Mechanisms for harm prevention is not an issue except on the real big corporations. And even when there is acknowledgement about it, it does not mean that the procedures are implemented. The Clinic of Human Rights at my university, together with GV in São Paulo, have made research on that. And this is what we have concluded looking at the 50 biggest companies in Brazil. So to wrap it up, Pillar 1 is not in really great shape because we lack a message from the state regarding its willingness to protect human rights. and the need for corporations to respect them. Pillar 2 needs some guidance. And Pillar 3, at least regarding state judicial mechanisms, while there are some fascinating developments that I can only hope that a special issue like this will help to spread and help to raise awareness. So although Brazil has not been a model for the region, despite the size of the country, the relevance, the economic relevance of the country, when we regard the state's duties in relation to the theme, it's not been a model. And we all depend on the state to seriously move the agenda forward. But the expectations are really high for the next years, not only for academics, but also for professionals, because with the state moving forward, of course, there will be much more to do. And of course, and most important of all, expectations can be high for victims too. So this is in short. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to highlight two points that you just raised. The first one, which is not just a reality for Latin America, but for other regions of the world, and I think it's the journal's view, at least some of the authors' view, that it is something prevalent in across the world, basically is how these political transitions offer both challenges and opportunities for continuity of these type of measures. But also, and I think that's actually very important, the need for guidance by the state, whether in soft instruments or hard instruments, but guidance. The state has to tell its counterparts and all of the different stakeholders what the actual expectations are, just as the UNGPs actually frame it, but expectations need to be translated into different types of instruments. Otherwise, it's just, some comments on different issues. Ulf, let me give you the floor to address the business sector's view in Latin America about business and human rights. What do you think? What can you share with us?
Thanks, Humberto. Well, I think this whole debate and discourse around business and human rights is a massive opportunity for businesses, but also for governments and civil society to finally come together to solve problems and to encounter some very threatening realities here in Latin America. So it's both a framing mechanism to find common ground and to find a common language, but it's also a highlighting mechanism to actually raise awareness in government, but also especially in the business community, but also in civil society, of certain problems and challenges, and to actually start to understand that there are at least certain common interests, and that each of these three parties, the business community, government, and civil society, also have a lot of homework to do. In Latin America, I think the business and human rights discourse, for instance, highlights the problem we have faced in Latin America for a very long time around state capacity, right? So the state, for instance, has to create a framework for business, clear regulations, but also the enforcement of law, obviously against the business community at certain stages. But the government or the executive, the state, also has a responsibility, for instance, in Colombia, to ensure fair competition and also security, especially in rural areas. I mean, we already mentioned the commodity sector, mining, oil and gas, for instance. And it's very interesting how a large part, for instance, of Colombian gold exports to world markets are derived from illegal or informal mining activities, right? And so we as a BHR community, we have to wrap our head around these realities. So we cannot always just criticize businesses, sometimes rightfully so, but I think maybe there's some legal empathy we should, or normative empathy we can develop at some stage. We also have to understand the difficulties in these markets. And this is not only informality, it's not only an issue in the mining sector, but of course, across the board in any economic activity in Latin American markets. For instance, any multinational that sells consumer goods also heavily relies on the informal sector. So the business community obviously is to blame for this. And I think via the BHR discourse, we can raise awareness there. But the business communities also encounter certain realities and challenges which governments and civil society at least have to understand in order to address this as a common endeavor, I think. And of course, then we have to ask ourselves whether law is really the only avenue to advance business and human rights in Latin America. Of course, law is very, very important, but we cannot just pull law or treaties out of a hat. There's a whole development that goes into treaties and hard law. And again, the business and human rights discourse can help us maybe debate these issues before they become hard law, which is so important at the end of the day to actually protect and then also remedy. And finally, we need to discuss issues of business education and to get more involved in management departments and business, not only for MBA students, because by the time an individual reaches the age of an MBA student, maybe it's already too late to really influence them and their thinking and their decision making. I think we should focus far more on high schools and of course also on undergraduate students. And I think businesses have to be more involved, show the opportunities that businesses bring to the region, but also be self-critical. Follow the letter of the law, or try to follow the letter of the law, but also try to instill in students a sense of the importance of the spirit of laws and the spirit of our very modern constitutions we have in Latin America. Thanks, Umberto.
Thank you, Ulf. And I would like to highlight here, while we wait or open the floor for questions, if there are any from our audience today, one very important point that you mentioned right at the end, and that is improving practice while we configure the normative framework. That is actually very important. And in any case, I do concur with you. I agree with you that we need to be able not to wait until there is a specific legal framework to move forward in this field. I think that's one of the key challenges and one of the key needs that we have in business and human rights in general worldwide, but particularly in our region. Very well, I think we have one question from Santiago Zuleta from Colombia. Greetings, Santiago, very nice to see you here. And he has a question. I don't know if it's directed to someone specifically, but of course, anyone is welcome to answer. His question is, are the UNGPs a relevant source of law for courts and tribunals in the region, including the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, when solving disputes arising from human rights abuses by corporations, and how do they contribute to judicial adjudication? I don't know if anyone wants to take a stab at it, but if I may use the floor as I have it right now. Indeed, Santiago, actually, there is a very short piece at the very end by Miguel Barbosa from the Konrad Adenauer Foundation and myself that addresses some interesting developments by courts on the business and human rights field. That is one document or one short article that may be of relevance or of interest perhaps to you on that topic, in addition to a lengthier book that several of us worked on for some time on access to remedy and Latin American experiences on remedy in business and human rights cases. But indeed, there are interesting judicial developments in the region that may actually contribute to a global conversation on aspects that have not been yet addressed by courts in other parts of the world. But if anyone wants to take the floor, please go ahead.
Well, if I may just to say that, Santiago, thank you very much for your question, very important. Just something is more about legal theory of international law, right, Umberto? And is, of course, these guiding principles serve as subsidiary sources of international law that, of course, could serve and be used by tribunals at any moment, but also, of course, we know when we talk about theory of soft law that at the end, these kind of guidelines become even more relevant than at the end in practice, right? More relevant than treatise itself. So just to mention that, to complement what Humberto just said.
Thank you. Enrique, I believe there's another question for Daniele, particularly Patricia Moraes asks you about your optimism for Brazil in the years to come. Can you explain further what are the expectations for academics and professionals in this field?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Patricia, for the question. I'm sorry. Well, I do think that with the developments that we are mostly likely to see on the following years, there's room for everybody to work really hard. So whenever the state starts raising awareness for the issue, it does mean that it will issue regulation, but it also means that we'll have fundings, for instance, for researchers, so academics will actually feel that we can study, we can research that. And the academy is the place, I've always said that it is the place to bring all the stakeholders together. So we do need this to actually bring people together so we can discuss and find better alternatives. Regarding professionals, I would say that if we will have regulation and either a soft law or not, I mean, corporations will want what to do. So there is already a demand for professionals regarding what Professor Ana Claudia was telling us on ESG. There is a high demand for people who understand that. And it's not only that, but it's also the SDGs. It's also the UNGPs, the due diligence on human rights. I mean, how many people know what to do? How many people know what is it exactly that the corporation needs to look for? And so, yes, I am really optimistic because I think that the more we talk about that, the more we will need to talk about it. Thank you.
Very well. Thank you very much, Danny. And we are practically out of time. So I would like to turn over to Jennifer for the wrap up of our webinar this morning. If there are any pending questions, of course, many of us are available in social media, so we can definitely continue talking there. And well, basically, it's a matter of continuing the conversation, not just, as Ulf said very correctly, among lawyers or in silos, but actually across disciplines and basically across regions. With that being said, thank you very much. And Jennifer, back to you.
Thank you all so much for your time. And thank you to everyone for joining today. A short survey will pop up momentarily if you wish to submit any more questions. We'll be sharing the recording of this within the next week, and we can also send around answers to some questions if there's anything else that we didn't have time to discuss today. And the BHRJ special issue on Latin America can be found at the journal's website, which is cambridge.org/BHRJ, and it's currently free to access. So many thanks again to all of you and have a great rest of the week.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Take care.